Good morning. It's a joy to be with you today, although I feel a little bit like my pastor at St. Matthew's, who has to preach to the Notre Dame theology department each Sunday. There's a number of Franciscans in the audience today, so I hope to do you justice. You might know that just this week we commemorated the 800th anniversary of St. Francis's reception of the Stigmata. And so it's a particularly fitting time to ask what it was that God, in his generosity and in his providence, was doing in allowing Il Poverino, the poor man of Assisi, to share his wounds. I've also, in a sense, brought Francis with me this morning. There's a reliquary here, which you are welcome to venerate after the talk, that contains a small portion of the ashes of both St. Francis and St. Clare. My talk this morning is entitled Glorifying Brother Ass. And so maybe we should start by asking, who is Brother Ass? I've known Matt Napoli for 4 years. No, it was on your name tag, but no. Yeah. Brother Ass is, as some of you might know, how Francis referred to his own body. In the Legenda Maior, the biography of St. Francis written by St. Bonaventure, the fifth master of the order, we hear the following. Francis, this is important. You can't see it yet. It'll be a reveal. I'm an Old Testament scholar, but somehow McGrath caught word that I had made stigmata sandwiches for my children. And they said, he's our guy, get him. He did it not once, but twice. So here we go. Anyhow. And no, I didn't bring any for you today, so tough luck. Only the relic. So here's what Bonaventure had to say. He said, Francis taught the brothers zealously to shun sloth as the sink of all evil thoughts, showing by his example that the rebellious and idle body must be subdued by unceasing discipline and profitable toil. Wherefore, he would call his body brother ass, as though it were meat to be loaded with toilsome burden, beat with many stripes, and nourished on mean fare. The point here is not to denigrate the value of the body or its place as something integral to the human person. As St. John Paul II said, we are our bodies. And yet, our physicality is a sort of poverty. C.S. Lewis, I think, expressed well what Francis had in mind in the Four Loves. And I realize this is an unfortunately crafted slide because it implies that C.S. Lewis is, in fact, Brother Ass. All right, I'll stop with it. But from his work, Four Loves, he said, first, there is that opinion of those ascetic pagans who call the body the prison or the tomb of the soul, and others to whom it was a sack of dung, food for worms, filthy, shameful, a source of nothing but temptation to bad men and humiliation to good ones. Then there are the neo-pagans, the nudists, and the sufferers from dark gods, to whom the body is, I'll say, simply and glorious. But thirdly, we have the view which St. Francis expressed by calling his body brother ass. All three may be defensible, but give me St. Francis for my money. Ass is exquisitely right because no one in his senses can either revere or hate a donkey. It is a useful, sturdy, lazy, obstinate, patient, lovable, and infuriating beast, deserving now a stick and now a carrot, both pathetically and absurdly beautiful. So the body. In receiving the stigmata, Francis's body is pierced and wounded. What I would like us to think about this morning is the meaning of that event. How is it that this seeming destruction of the body is actually the moment of its and our glorification? In Francis, we'll come to see that his lovable and infuriating beast, this least noble aspect of ourselves, is in fact an indispensable source of a likeness to and a union with Christ our beloved. But let's begin by taking a moment to recount St. Francis's reception of the stigmata. On the 14th of September in the year 1224, 2 years before the end of his life and some 17 since he first embraced a life of radical poverty and fraternity, Francis went to pray in a hermitage on Mount Alverna. Thomas of Solano in his Vita Prima, he's the first biographer of Francis, tells the story in this way. It's a little bit long, 2 slides, but it's worth reading in its entirety. When he was staying in a hermitage called Alverna from the place where it stood, 2 years before he gave his soul back to heaven, he had a vision from God. There appeared to him a man like a seraph with 6 wings, standing above him with his hands extended and feet joined, fixed to a cross. 2 wings were raised above his head, 2 were extended for flight, and 2 covered his body. When the blessed servant of the Most High saw these things, he was filled with greatest wonder, but he did not understand what this was supposed to mean to him. But at the same time, he was frightened in seeing him fixed to the cross in bitter pain of suffering. Francis arose, if I may say so, sad and happy, such that joy and grief alternated in him. He anxiously meditated on what the vision could mean, and for this reason his spirit was greatly troubled. While he was unable to come to any understanding of it, and his heart was entirely preoccupied with it, this is what happened. The marks of the nails began to appear in his hands and feet, just as he had seen them before in the crucified man above him. His hands and feet appeared to be pierced in the center by nails, whose heads were visible on the inner side of his hands and on the upper part of his feet, while the pointed ends protruded from the opposite sides. The marks on his hands were round on the inner side and elongated on the outer, and small pieces of flesh looked like the ends of the nails, bent and beaten back and rising above the rest of the flesh. In the same way, the marks of the nails were impressed on his feet and raised above the rest of the flesh. His right side was also pierced as if with a lance and covered over with a scar, and it often bled, and his tunic and his undergarments were often sprinkled with his sacred blood. Now, this is a bit of an aside briefly, but let me say a word about the seraph, which always seems to cause some confusion. In this account, the man, like a seraph with 6 wings, is not named as Christ explicitly, but his identity is clear. And later in St. Bonaventure's telling of the story, the identification is made explicit. Francis rejoiced because, quote, of the gracious way Christ looked at him under the appearance of the seraph. Friends, there's an echo here of the divine theophanies in the Old Testament, where God and the angel of God are almost interchangeable. So here, the seraphim, who stand in the assembly around Christ, communicate to Francis him who was crucified. As one scholar notes, just as we apprehend Christ in the Eucharist, sub specie, that is, under the appearance of bread and wine, so according to Bonaventure, Francis encounters Christ sub specie, that is, under the appearance of the seraphim. Now, Francis's reception of Christ's wounds come as a result of this encounter. He does not, however, receive the wounds in the moment of the vision itself, but only afterwards in contemplation, when his heart was entirely preoccupied with what he had seen. Bonaventure takes note of this, and in the Mind's Road to God, he said that Christ so absorbed the mind of Francis that his soul was manifest in his flesh. Said differently, the conformity of St. Francis's mind to the crucified Lord led also to the conformity of his flesh to the crucified. Now, this is a truthful account, and it's a good habit not to disagree with doctors of the church. But the role of the body in this telling might sound like something of an afterthought. It is the mind in its contemplation of God that is the real source of union. The body seems, almost accidentally, to share in the union first achieved elsewhere. It's not the occasion of such a union, the body isn't. Now, I don't wish to deny this connection between contemplation and the transformation of Francis's body, but I wonder if we might view the stigmata not as the culmination of the contemplative life, or at least not the culmination of the contemplative life alone, but as the culmination of something else, something like the stigmata itself, which is particular to Francis, namely the life of radical poverty. These 2 elements of Francis's life, the stigmata and the particular reason for which Francis chose to embrace poverty, are, as I suggested, unique to him. Francis is the first person in the tradition to receive the gift of the stigmata. Apologies to St. Paul at the end of Galatians, that's not what stigmata means when he says he bears the wounds of Christ, or the marks of Christ in his body. Francis is, by all accounts, the first. And so on October 3rd, 1226, in a letter announcing the death of St. Francis, Brother Elias writes the following, And now I announce to you a great joy, a new miracle. The world has never heard of such a miracle except in the Son of God, who is Christ our Lord. A little while before his death, our brother and father appeared crucified, bearing in his body the 5 wounds, which are the stigmata of Christ. Now, alongside this novelty, I want to note the novelty of Francis's devotion to Lady Poverty. Francis's life of self-denial was not, as in the case of earlier ascetics, merely undertaken as a means to train the body, nor was it instrumental in some other way, as with his contemporaries, the Dominicans, for whom poverty was sort of a means to more effective itinerant preaching. Not so for Francis. Rather, Francis's love of poverty was undertaken simply in imitation of Christ, his beloved. Lady Poverty, as he called her, was to be loved not for the sake of some other goal, but only so as to draw near to Christ. And now let's connect these two particular things, the stigmata and his embrace of Lady Poverty. In the Paradiso, we can see the link between these novelties. In his crucifixion, Christ undergoes his last and greatest deprivation, his last and greatest poverty. And so in Canto 11, Dante says of Lady Poverty that she, quote, mounted on the cross with Christ. Said differently, poverty culminates in the crucifixion. And it is this same lady whom Francis comes to embrace. Dante writes, she, Lady Poverty, bereft of her first husband, despised and obscured 1,100 years and more, remained without a suitor until he came, Francis. As with Christ, so with Francis, the last and greatest deprivation, the last and greatest poverty is found on the cross. As Christ's self-emptying culminates in the crucifixion, so Francis's unique embrace of poverty culminates in the reception of his stigmata. What needs to be asked now is just what this conformity to Christ means. We would, I'm afraid, miss the point entirely if the correspondence between Jesus and Francis were understood only as a kind of imitation. There is, of course, a correspondence between the two. As Chesterton quipped, Jesus was like St. Francis. And as the seal of the Order of the Friars Minor, which you saw on the opening slide suggestively sort of presents to us, you see the arm of Christ coming from the left and the arm of Francis beneath it coming from the right. So there's a clear imitation, a clear similarity. In Francis's mind, in his habit of life, in his flesh, he resembles Jesus. But none of this necessarily moves us beyond the realm of imitation. The question we should ask, and it's the question my student Daphne McCabe asked me in my office this week, is why the stigmata is something desirable. I can understand wishing to emulate somebody in their glory, but why imitate them in their brokenness? What's the value in that? So, friends, to see what it really means for Francis to bear the wounds of Christ, let's ask first what it means for Christ to bear the wounds of Christ. And if we can get that right, we can come back and understand what's taking place in the flesh of Francis. And we're going to come to see Francis not only as someone who is like Christ, but as someone who is utterly and completely with Christ. There's a big distinction there to be sussed out. So let's turn for a minute to the cross and the resurrection. What does it mean for Christ to bear Christ's wounds? And let's jump right in the deep end. This is Father FX Durwell. And here's what he has to say. Brace yourself. It's tricky. And just to forewarn you, not heresy. Okay. Just so we're clear. Christ will never leave behind that immolation and that new life. His existence in the resurrection is fixed forever at the moment of the redemption. Sketchy. The 5 wounds he showed his disciples are not merely the receipt for a ransom inscribed upon his body, but the wounds of a death from which he will never recover. He did not rise to the life he had before, to this world, to this time. In that sense, he did not rise at all. He dies once for all. And pay attention to this last line. The life of glory, that is the resurrected life, is a perpetuation of his death. Now, hold up. We're accustomed, I think, to separating Good Friday and Easter Sunday and imagining them as opposites. And of course, in one sense, they very much are. We have on one hand the defeat of Christ in death, and on the other, his victory in the resurrection. Durwell, though, invites us to see these in unison, or better, he invites us to see the one as the continuation or the revivification of the other. As he writes, the life of glory, which is to say the resurrection, is a perpetuation of his death. But what could that mean? Well, we need to ask ourselves why Christ suffers. The passion is not a random act of violence. It is the direct result of God's drawing near to us. The passion is the encounter of a relentless and all-embracing love with the world and all of its brokenness. That's why Christ suffers. Love suffers in a broken world. That's the cause of his wounds. An analogy will help here. In our parish, I told my daughter Zaylee before I started that I'm a weepy Italian, so if I start crying, she has to yell, "Dad!" So it's like Philip Neri, who had a duck in the sanctuary so he wouldn't levitate during Mass. This is the knockoff version of that. So there was a young woman in our parish named Emily. She had some developmental disabilities. She sat in the back row. And when she walked up to communion, she was, at this point in life, bigger than her mom, and she would flail through, not voluntarily. And she would hit her mom, again, not voluntarily. Here's how I think about it. The passion, that is the suffering that the mother undergoes, is not a random act of violence. It is the direct result of the mom drawing near to Emily. The passion is the encounter of a relentless and all-embracing love of the mom with Emily and her many trials. So Christ with you. Only unlike Emily, our flailing is willful. So with Christ, the crucifixion is the culmination of his drawing near, and the resurrection, and here's the key to understanding Durwell's text, the resurrection is the perpetuation of that. Easter Sunday is Christ carrying forward the same relentless drawing near that took his life on Friday. Will an analogy help? Yeah, okay. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King did not wake up and say, "I want to get shot today." He woke up to do the same thing that he had been doing for years, to tell you and the rest of his fellow Americans the truth about all the people in this country, black or white, and our universal dignity. He's shot. If Martin were to rise on April 5th, what do you think he would keep doing? The same exact thing. It's like St. Denis, whose head is cut off, and he picks it up, according to the legend, and keeps giving the sermon, right? You keep doing the same thing. The life of the resurrection is just a perpetuation of what took your life on Good Friday. Christ, who says, "Forgive them, they know not what they do," meets us in the resurrection and says, "Peace be with you." It's the same act. It's the same approach. He has borne every rejection and continues to approach us and say, "Peace be with you." The life of glory is a perpetuation of what he was doing on Friday. This is what Durwell means when he says, the life of glory is a perpetuation of his death. He doesn't mean Christ is eternally suffering. He means he keeps relentlessly, doggedly doing the same thing. He does not recover from such wounds in the sense that he moves beyond Good Friday, moves beyond the very activity that caused his suffering. No, he keeps going, even now. Christ's life is fixed forever in that moment. I'll say it again. Christ's life is fixed forever in that moment, in the total and complete self-emptying for love of neighbor. What it means for Christ to bear his wounds is for him to be relentlessly and lovingly present with the whole of his person to those whom he loves. Simone Weil, the French mystic, said that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. In the resurrection, Christ attends to us with the whole of his person, the entirety of his person. He gives the rarest and purest form of generosity to his beloved, namely his whole and undivided self in the form of gift, the Eucharist. Back to Francis. If this then is what it means for Christ to bear his wounds, something similar must be true of Francis. There's no possibility that the stigmata is simply the imprinting of physical wounds. It's not just a hole in the hand and a wound in the side. It's not an imitation of Christ in any reductive physical way. Rather, it's the generating in the whole person of Francis, soul and lowly brother ass. It's the generating in Francis the same work which Christ continues to carry out. As such, the gift of the stigmata creates much more than an external likeness. It generates solidarity and communion with Christ. It allows Francis not only to be like Christ, but to be with Christ. And when we see this is true, we see that every moment of suffering, of rejection, of misunderstanding and betrayal become, most wonderfully, moments of perfect joy, because they are moments in which Francis can be like, and more importantly, can be with Christ. Let me venture one more analogy. It's absurd, and I'm going to cry, but I'm going to do it. But this will make clear what I'm trying to say about the stigmata. My friend Ian has a son, Cashin. And Ian said to me, every time we're on a plane and Cashin walks down the aisle, I think, what if the emergency door blew off and Cashin were sucked out? I told you. He goes on, I think about how I would jump out after him. Not because I could save him, but only so that he would not have to fall alone. I know, on one hand, this is a silly example, and no one in the right mind would tear up about it. But try and sympathize with it for a minute. The point of Ian jumping is not to be like his son Cashin, like, oh, you're falling, I'm falling too. It's not to be like, the point is to be with. To be his beloved. To be with his beloved. So the beloved is not alone. And that's the answer to your question, why the stigmata is desirable, so that you might be with your beloved. I know that Francis didn't pray for the stigmata. It came upon him after the vision. But I think in this vein he might have. And playfully, I think he might have done so with the words of a singer I like, Sierra Farrell, who said, "You're already one of a kind. Why not make it two?" And so let me say again, the gift of the stigmata creates much more than an external likeness. It makes Francis not only more perfectly like Christ, but more perfectly with him. It is one of the last and certainly the greatest, moment of Francis drawing near to his beloved. And it helps us understand how every moment of suffering, rejection, misunderstanding, and betrayal were received by Francis most wonderfully as moments of perfect joy, because they are moments in which Francis can be like and can be with Christ. And friends, this doesn't apply just to Francis. Indeed, all such moments lived in the flesh, from painful knees to bulging discs to cancerous thyroids, to name some close to home, are or can be moments of what Francis calls perfect joy. With this in mind, I want to read one more passage from the Fioretti, the Little Flowers of St. Francis, called The Perfect Joy of St. Francis, which is a confusing passage, but if you've followed so far, this will make sense. This also is a long one. That's a different Francis, by the way, praying But I put it up because it mentions in the second line this place called the Portiuncola, which is the little chapel formerly belonging to the Benedictines, which Francis and his initial brothers sort of inhabited down at the foot of the old city of Assisi. On a cold winter's day, St. Francis walked with Brother Leo from Perugia to the Portiuncola. Because of their poverty, they suffered much in the cold. At one point, St. Francis said to Brother Leo, "If God desires that the friars minor should serve as a great example of holiness to all people in all lands, please write down that this would not be perfect joy." At some point later in their journey, St. Francis said to Brother Leo, "If the friars minor could make the lame walk, if they could straighten the crooked, if they could chase away demons, if we could give sight to the blind and speech to the dumb, and even if we could raise the dead after 4 days, please write down and note carefully that this would not be perfect joy." He goes on to say more of the same. Let me, for the sake of time, skip that. When this manner of discourse had lasted for several miles, Francis naming the wondrous things that are not perfect joy, Brother Leo, who had been thinking about these things, said, "Father Francis, I pray that you will teach me about perfect joy. You've told me everything it's not, right?" St. Francis answered, "If we arrived at the Portiuncola, and if we are drenched with rain and trembling with cold, covered in mud and exhausted from hunger, and if we knock on the convent gate, and if we are not recognized by the porter, and if he tells us that we are impostors who seek to deceive the world and steal from the poor, and if he refuses to open the gate, and if he leaves us outside, exposed to the rain and snow, suffering from cold and hunger, then if we embrace the injustice, cruelty, and contempt with patience, without complaining, and if we believe in faith, love, and humility that the porter knew us but was told by God to reject us, then, my dear Brother Leo, please write down and note carefully that this also is perfect joy." St. Francis then said, "Brother Leo, if we knock again, and if the porter drives us away with curses and blows, and if he accuses us of robbery and other crimes, and if we embrace this with patience, without complaining, and if we believe in faith, love, and humility that the porter knew us, but was told by God to reject us again, then, my dear Brother Leo, please write down and note carefully that this is perfect joy." And St. Francis said once more, "If urged by cold and hunger we knock again, if we call again to the porter, if we plead to him with many tears to open the gate and to give us shelter out of love for God, and if he returns more angry than ever, and if he calls us annoying rascals and beats us with a knotted stick, and if he throws us to the ground, rolls us in the snow, and beats us again with the knotted stick," that's a good job, "and if we bear these injuries with patience and without complaining, if we think upon the sufferings of our blessed crucified Lord, then, most beloved Brother Leo, please write down and note carefully that this, finally, is perfect joy." A word of conclusion. In the Eucharist, we confess the real presence of Christ, body, blood, soul, divinity. There is in this confession a very important Christological claim, namely, that the human nature which the Son has taken to himself really and truly belongs to him. And so, if we would draw near to Christ, we must draw near not only to Christ in his divinity, whatever that might mean, but we must draw near to Christ in his humanity as well. We must embrace his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And of course, the condition of our being able to do that is that we ourselves are bodily. How else would you embrace the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, save that you yourself are a bodily creature? It is with good reason, then, that there is a long and pious tradition of approaching the Eucharist with a deep bow and with the words from the Song of Songs, which is Hebrew, for "May you kiss me with the kisses of your mouth." It's my daughter, Anna. Well done. In Francis, we come to see the particular character of this bodily embrace. Christ's life of glory is, as Durwell told us, a perpetuation of his death, which is to say, a perpetuation of Christ's complete self-offering to those whom he loves. In his embrace of the life that Christ lived, in the embrace of Lady Poverty, Francis draws near to his own beloved, to Christ. To be accused, beaten, left in the snow, and even pierced with the wounds of the crucifixion is therefore perfect joy. Not because these things are good in themselves, but because in bearing them, Francis is with his beloved. He is not just someone who imitates Christ. He is someone who accompanies him. The body, that lovable and infuriating beast, far from being an intrinsic obstacle to the spiritual life, is in fact the occasion for the full embrace of him who has taken flesh for our sakes. The deprivation of the body through the embrace of Lady Poverty and the wounding of the body and the reception of the stigmata are, paradoxically, the moment of the body's glorification, the glorification of Brother Ass. Thank you.